Welcome to another great episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains. We're going to continue today with Jack San Felice as he tells us more about the Silver King mine and how the town began. Jack, they were out in the middle of nowhere. So how did they get all this silver and gold processed?
They would bring that ore out, and it was so rich, then they had to get mule trains to get it to where they could send it by boat to Wales, and because that's where the smelter was. After the first year, there was a smelter built in San Francisco, okay? And a mint built in San Francisco. So then they started transferring the ore to San Francisco. And they said, no, the third year they said, this is too costly, and to travel that far, they tried camels. Well, the camels could go through the desert fine, but they spooked the mules and they spooked the horses, and they spooked the people, because they were strange-looking creatures. So that didn't work, and their feet got sore from walking over on the rocks. They were used to walking on sand. They were great because they could make it with the water in their bellies. So they decided that they're going to have to build a trail, and that's what they did. They built the trail from Florence. They followed a trail to where they followed an old stagecoach trail, and they got down to where they would then get to a place where then they could ship the ore. 1875, they could actually ship it then.
All right, so another big question is, where did they get the labor force? And besides that, where did they live?
While they were building this, the infrastructure up here, it started to grow. People started to come here, miners. They built not log cabins, but stone cabins. Cabins made out of stones and then some brush on the top. Then they started hauling wood in and tin to make actual real living places. The Silver King eventually had 500 people living in it. Now, let me jump back down to the mills. They built 3 mills down below. And one was the Silver King and one was the 76. And I'm trying to remember the name. I can't remember the name of the third, but it's in the book. I found all 3 of those remnants of those mills down there. But like I say, it is 5 miles because you got to zigzag. And I found the old trail through the mountains all the way down. The old trail actually led past the old cemetery down there, the Superior Cemetery. But before that, it was the old Silver King Cemetery and Pinnell Cemetery. And now they would take it down to Pinnell to these mills, and then they had 20 stamp mills down there. They had 3 5-stamp mills, and then they had another small mill, another 5 stamps. So they had 20 stamps altogether. Now, stamp mill is a great big piece of metal on the bottom, and they haul it up in the early days by mules. They would pull it up by ropes, and then would go across a circular device like...
Are you talking about a pulley or a cam?
A cam that would bring it around so that the ropes would go through it. And then they eventually got cable, and then they got steam. But originally there was mules, and there was men, and there was mules, and then they would bid it up about 15, 20 feet, and they would drop it on the ore down below, splat, and it would just crush it. And they kept dropping it until it was good enough to turn into ore that could be cooked. And I say ore was cooked. In the mills, there was a process which they had to heat up, and they had to wet the ore, and then they had to run it over some steam heaters, and it would actually cook the ore so that you could then reprocess the ore doing chemicals. Without that process, you couldn't get the gold and the max silver out of it. Because there were compounds in it like sulfur that you had to get out of that ore. Then when that process is done, and I talk about those boiler type devices, I even have the names and the process in the book, explains all of that. And I explain the whole process of making silver and gold. And anyhow, you get down to that process, and they use different processes. Sometimes they use cyanide, sometimes they use mercury vats, and then after they cook this, they would get this ore, and then it would be amenable to cyanide, which could then break down to compounds, and then would get rid of the rock and the dirt part of it, and it would turn it into a mass of material that they would take into a smelter, and then it was smelted at 2,000 degrees. First they ran about 1,500. They tried to get the gold off first, because gold is softer than silver. So they tried to get the gold off. Well, then they tried to get both gold and silver, 2,000 degrees. Then that would go into a cooling form made out of cast iron, and in that would turn into a hard piece of metal. On the top, what would happen? They would take salt, silica, and something like borax, and they would then heat that to 2,000 degrees, mix it with the what's called the concentrates. The concentrated ore in a very tight fashion. In other words, they've reduced the ore from this size down to this size, where what's the silver and the gold and the other metals are in it, copper. So they would then smelt that down to a bar that was about 40 pounds. Sometimes they were even 20-pound bars. And then they would take these bars and they would be shipped by Wells Fargo covered stages. They weren't Wells Fargo stages. Wells Fargo himself didn't own that many stagecoaches. The name Wells Fargo would be on there, but Wells Fargo guaranteed that the mail would go through, and that the whatever letters and whatever bullion that the mines were sending would go through to the refineries, and they turned it then into coins. They turn, of course, in San Francisco, they turn at the mint, they turn the silver into silver dollars, and then they turn the gold into $5 or $20 gold pieces, which was about the same size as a silver dollar, only it was worth 16 times as much. Today, gold is worth about 200 times more than silver. In the old days, silver was $4 an ounce. Okay, and it stayed at $4 an ounce for years and years. Like I say, the mine that grew up here around the town was called Silver King. Most people just called it the King. We're on our way to the King, and everybody knew what the King was.
We'd like to thank Jack San Felice for once again joining us and telling us about history of the area. It's hard to believe all that happened out here, but it's gone now. It's all part of the mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.